Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. I'm so excited to be talking with Tiago Forte about his new book, Building a Second Brain. So I was one of the thousands of people that has taken Tiago's course, Building a Second Brain. It's been so helpful to me, and reading his new book on the topic, which I think is coming out in August, was a great just reminder of all the material. It got me so energized to start, doing more creating. So Tiago, welcome to the session here.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So, as we were chatting earlier, most of the audience here is independent management consultants. And you can assume, some people may be familiar with your work. Some people may have note-taking apps. What I thought we could do is have you walk us through a bit of a case study of how to apply the Building a Second Brain principles to a management consulting assignment. And a fairly typical one that most people will do some aspect of is sort of a market landscape study, right? Where you're studying an industry, might be focused on one particular company, but you're going to be doing, primary interviews with some experts. You're going to be downloading some reports. You're getting some data and expected to pull that together in a report in 3 or 4 weeks. So, historically, when I've done these kinds of works, you're just saving all sorts of files. You have random notes, handwritten things in notebooks, and it's a bit of a mess. So walk us through it, maybe from first principles, walk us through, CODE and PARA, and just give us an intro to the tools and help us understand, how to get started.
Yeah, okay. My pleasure. So let me actually start even before that. I think the background, the experience that led to the creation of this book is strongly shaped by my experience in consulting. My first professional job when I served in the Peace Corps in Ukraine, and then I returned to California to San Francisco, got my first, real job, professional job at a small boutique consulting firm called FaberNovel, which is actually a French company based in Paris who has offices in a few different cities, but one of them was in San Francisco. And it was one of my first professional experiences. So that was kind of my introduction to work, my introduction to business, my introduction to the professional world, professional culture. And I think when you read this book, if you read this book, you'll see the fingerprints of consulting everywhere, right? And specifically, what I learned in that role, first of all, I was the most junior person in the organization. I was like a junior project analyst. There was no one lower on the totem pole, right? And so I sort of got to witness firsthand the business model of consulting, which I would summarize. So the way I think about it is consultants are really rapid learners. That's mostly what we do as consultants. We are rapidly learning new things, whether it's about the market, the landscape, the competitive arena, like external, or whether it's internal, right? Just as important, we have to learn the client's culture, the client's power structure, the client's priorities, the client's communication preferences. And we have to do both that external and internal learning so fast, right? Using as few billable hours as possible, because the client doesn't really want to pay you for a lot of learning, open-ended learning hours. We have to do it fast. We have to do it rapidly. We have to do it showing evidence that we're doing it well. And we have to do it again and again and again and again. Like, that's the thing that always amazed me about consulting. We have to bring our very best thinking, because that's essentially what we're being paid to do. We have to bring our best thinking to the table every single day. As a consultant, you never get to coast. You never get to just phone it in. You're being paid to think. And so the results of your efforts are based on the quality of your thinking. So here's what I took away from kind of noticing that is, at the very practical level, how we did business development, I noticed behind the scenes that we would learn a topic. Let's say, for example, one of them was self-driving cars. We were in San Francisco, all about innovation. So at one point we did a client project. I think it was for one of the automakers, where we advised them and consulted with them on the future potential and competitive landscape of self-driving cars, which is such an expensive thing to learn, right? Like, do you get how expensive learning is? It's so time consuming, so energy consuming. It's messy, right? You can't just learn something by checking boxes. It's exploratory, it's divergent, it's chaotic. You go down wrong paths, you make mistakes, you try things and fail, you go back. It's so messy. all of which means it's tremendously expensive. But once you've learned something, once we learned, say, self-driving cars, we went around and sold that knowledge to as many clients as we could, which is what you have to do as consultants, right? Once you've acquired, you've mastered one framework, or you've learned one industry, or learned one, I don't know, way of improving an organization, you have to get that knowledge and just replicate as many times as you can. It's almost like our version of manufacturing, right? You design a car and you just manufacture as many copies as possible. As consultants, we learn a subject and then we just apply that subject to as many projects and as many clients as we can. And that's, as far as I could see, that was the only way to be profitable as a consulting firm, was to replicate the knowledge as many times as possible. Which brings up a question, and this is where I started really taking notes professionally. I had done it before for personal reasons, for health reasons, but I started realizing, wait a minute, my effectiveness as a professional, the results I produce for my clients, not to mention my quality of life, my ability to leave the office while the sun was still shining, all depend on my personal, because by the way, the consulting firm doesn't help you with this so much, right? They don't have a problem with you staying up all night working on that thing. So you kind of have to take it on yourself. I started just collecting everything in one single centralized place. And every time a request was made of me by the client, by someone more senior in the organization, the very first thing I would do is go into that knowledge repository and try to find some building block, case study, template, some precedent, some at least example that I could build upon or reuse or use as a model, and really try to avoid at all costs starting from scratch, anything. Okay, so that is the context of a second brain for consulting, is simply preserving, organizing, and then reusing, reapplying the knowledge that you've spent so much time and effort to acquire, to just have more leverage, be more efficient, save time, and do, that quality thinking again and again. Is that helpful? Was that a helpful bridge?
No, that's a good intro. And it's often the case where something that you learn on one project, you could repurpose it, you could use it to create content, to post, put it into a newsletter, put a post on LinkedIn, incorporate some other way, right? So for folks who are, and I didn't mention one thing, so I'll mention this now. So for the folks that are actually attending this session, go ahead and put your name in the chat so we have you, because we're going to send out a free copy of Tiago's book to everyone who's attending. And for people that are listening to a recording, the first 25 folks that get back to us, will send you a copy too when it comes out in August. So Tiago, let's say for someone who does not yet have Evernote, who's thought about it, whatever, walk us through the core principles of capture, organize, distill, express. And maybe we just start with capture. It'd be great for you to just kind of give us an overview of some of the tools that are out there and some of the principles of each one of those steps.
Sure. Yeah. So code, CODE, is my model. It's so simple and still somehow took me, a decade to arrive at, like all simple frameworks, that describes the fundamental nature of the creative process. I'm trying to find a systematic approach to creativity so that when I go to be creative, I'm not just like in an empty room, blank slate, blank canvas, creating from nothing, which is actually not that effective. It's more like Legos. I was a huge fan of Legos as a kid. And what do you do with Legos? First thing you do is get that huge bin and dump it on the floor, and then just start going like this, right? Just start putting things together, seeing if that fits, seeing if this fits, trying different things. It's kind of like Scrabble tiles also, right? What do you do when you're looking for a word? You just start moving the tiles and seeing what jumps out at you. You need something to touch and interact with. So that's code. And it's designed to be universal across any profession. So let's go through it. First one is capture. Before you can do anything else, you have to document. You have to get ideas and knowledge and information out of here, right, where it's vague and kind of mysterious and very intangible, into some kind, any kind of external format. That can be a photograph. It could be a sketch or a drawing. It can be text. It can be a web bookmark. It can be so many different things. Take your pick, right? Only then, when it's external, can you start to work with it. Once you've externalized it, captured it, we move on to O, which is organize, right? You have to add some kind of structure, some kind of order, prioritize what's important and what's not, put it in different groups based on whether it's for this project or this client or this part of your life or this aspect of your business, right? You can't really do much when the Legos are all in one giant bin. You can't do much. You have to sort of spread them out and then start putting them into groups. Once you've done that, so each step enables and sets the stage for the next one, right? So once you've organized, you can distill. And this is the missing link for most people. For most people's note-taking and what we call knowledge management, distill is the thing they don't even know they need. And it just means to get whatever the information is and boil it down to its essence. Boil it down, refine it, synthesize it down into the main takeaways, the main points, the main conclusions, whatever that looks like for you. And the reason that's important is you need to be able to find the signal in the noise, right? Information is always noisy. There's just all these random details. You have to find the signal in the noise, which, by the way, you're also good at doing as consultants, right? That's kind of what you're paid to do. The client is like, here's a bunch of noise. Help me find the signal. Okay. And once you have those key points, those distilled, takeaways or highlights, you can do the final stage, which is express. Express, self-expression. Express, reshare that knowledge in some form, whether it's writing, speaking, presenting, designing, building, launching, publishing, sharing, selling. There's many synonyms for the act of expression. And those steps, they're not linear, 1 through 4 only. They're more like a loop. You code, and then you code, and then you code again and again. Each iteration, refining and adding value until you get to the point that you can communicate so much value so succinctly, right? As a model or a framework or a conclusion or theory or, whatever that looks like for you. So that's code.
Yeah. So I've gotten a bit better at capture since I took your course. I use Evernote. I guess you can certainly use other note-taking apps. And so I've certainly got now in the habit of when I'm reading some article online, I'm like, oh, I might want to refer to this again. So I'll save it to Evernote just right from my phone, right? The other thing I do now is if I'm doing an interview with someone for whatever project, I'll normally just type that right into Evernote. I'll just type my notes right in there. So at least I have it. I'm not as good as I should be about organizing, I know, but at least I'm doing that piece. And I also like the fact that you emphasize that you don't feel guilty if you're not 100% perfect at all this, right? At least start by capturing it. So what are some of maybe you could walk us through, double click on capture and walk us through what are for someone who hasn't started with Evernote or doesn't have maybe an ebook capture tool or hasn't done any of these, go through some of the categories for us. What are some of the tools that you recommend? And I know that you have a resource online where you're constantly updating it, right? At I think buildingasecondbrain.com/resources for folks. And we can pop that link in the chat.
Actually, I have even something better.
Oh, fantastic. We
just launched literally like days ago, the Second Brain Resource Guide. This is, so throughout the book, every time it comes time to recommend a specific app, I didn't want to do that in the text of the book because things change.
Changing all the time.
They're changing every 3 months, 4 months in this industry, the whole landscape changes. So instead, we link to this resource guide, which we've never shared anywhere. You guys will be the first ones to see it. There it is in the chat. Maybe I can even share my screen.
Yeah, there you go.
Really, the idea is to choose first and foremost your note-taking app, which is kind of like the neural center of your second brain. And we just published this video that kind of leads you through some of the most popular examples. But to answer your question, here are some of the other recommended tools and apps. So you have lots of options. You have basic notes apps. For example, if you have Apple Notes, on your phone. That's not really full featured enough to serve as your second brain, but it can be used as a what we call a capture tool, right? It's so easy to save things in Apple Notes or whatever your default notes app is. You might want to use that as kind of like an inbox. You can use ebook apps, and there's various ways, such as using Readwise, that you can sync up, say, the Kindle app with your notes app, so that this is kind of hard to believe until you see it, but every time you take a highlight with no further action required, a service like Readwise will automatically import those highlights into a single centralized note in your notes app. You have podcast and audio transcription apps if you like to do voice memos. There's one called Otter AI that you can just speak into your phone and have that exported to your notes app. There are Read Later apps, which are like Instapaper or Pocket, where you can save links from the web. Say you come across a blog post, you don't want to interrupt your workday to go read 20, 30 minutes of random content. You can save it in a distraction-free reading environment, such as Instapaper or Pocket. And then there's web clippers for saving bookmarks or just parts of web pages. And there's PDF readers. Those are some of the capture tools. And if you want even more specific recommendations, you can go down here, and we have this table that we're updating constantly with which category they fall into, which operating system each tool is for, and a link to their website. Will, that you want to go deeper into?
Yeah. So, and I love the suggestion that you have of just sort of when you have a thought on the go to capture it. So that's been helpful to me. I do that now in Evernote. Tell us a little about the podcast and audio transcription. So like, let's say you're listening to a podcast and there's a snippet where you want to remember that quote. How would you go ahead and capture that quote and save it so that you could refer to it later?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the exciting frontiers of knowledge management, I would say, is the audio revolution and also the video revolution. I can give a few recommendations. So one is, so it kind of depends what your source is. If you're just speaking, I definitely recommend Otter AI, OTTER.ai is the website. It's the most accurate. I think it's 98.5% accurate. I've used it, when I first started using it, I was living in Mexico City, and I remember standing at a super busy intersection downtown Mexico City, speaking into this app, just holding it in my hand and thinking there's no way it's gonna understand this. And then seeing as I'm speaking the words, be transcribed with near perfect accuracy. I think we're really reaching an exciting moment where automatic transcription is very close to human accuracy. If you listen to podcasts, there is one called AIRR, AIRR. There might be 3 R's, AIRRR. I'm not sure. I think you have to sign up for the waitlist or the beta, but they're basically making it so as you're listening to a podcast, you just hit transcribe and it gets a 15-second clip, the 15 seconds you just listened to, and it turns it into a note, which you can then export to your notes app. And then one more I'll say is, actually 2 more things I'll say. If you listen to or read Kindle ebooks, Kindle now has a feature where I think for a small extra fee, you can get both the ebook version and the audiobook version of the same book. And what's cool is because it's the same platform, they sync up. So you can be walking, this is how I use it. You can be walking, listening to an ebook. And if they say something really exciting and interesting, you just pause and there's a button that says open in ebook, and you tap it, and right there in the moment on the device, it just switches over to the Kindle app and opens the book to that exact place where you can read it in more detail. You can make a highlight with the exact part that you want to save, and then you just switch back over to the Audible app and keep listening. It's pretty cool. And then finally, for video, YouTube has a transcription feature. Some people don't know this. There's a little button that's automatically generated on most videos that just says open transcript. You click that and it will kind of follow along in the transcript to match where the video is playing. And so instead of trying to listen and trying to hear what they're saying and write it down and through typing, you can just follow the transcript and cut and paste, copy and paste directly from the transcript into your notes. That's usually how I take notes on YouTube videos.
Talk to us a bit about the distill step. So once you go along, you're capturing the notes, maybe you save an article that you thought was interesting, or you take a bunch of notes in a meeting and you might save it. Later on, you recommend going back and distilling that so you have the essence of it, you can refer to it later. Walk us through that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So distilling is at the most basic level, it is simply designing a note, right? Think about as humans how exquisitely sensitive we are to the way that information is presented, right? If you have any experience with web design, you know, I mean, this is really how we've discovered this. The smallest changes to how a website is presented can have dramatic impacts on people's behavior, right? We know this very well. The shade of Google tested, I think, 33 shades of blue for their links on google.com. And they found like not small, significant differences based on almost imperceptible differences in the shade of blue for links, right? The margins on a website, the header that's there, the hero image, right? The call to action, the colors, the shapes, the photographs, the contrast, the spacing, all these elements we know make a major difference, right? And so we have a whole industry built around this, web designers and usability specialists and UX designers and graphic designers. But then when it comes to our notes, suddenly we throw all that out the window, and we take notes as if the way that like a single note is designed doesn't matter. Like, what are the headings? What are the sections? How much white space? How much separation between bullet points? Do you use bullet points or numbers or nothing? Do you use colors? Do you use different kinds of formatting, underlining, bold? Like, these decisions, I think, are vastly underestimated. And so I teach a method for distillation, which is the one, there's various ways to do distillation. There's not just one, but my favorite is called progressive summarization. If you do a search for progressive summarization, you can find resources, tutorials, both on my channels and ones that other people have created. It's basically highlighting, okay? It's like the highlighting you did in school. Everyone knows how to highlight. Everyone knows what highlights are. Everyone knows what highlights mean. A highlight just means this matters. This is important. But we're doing it in a slightly different way, not for a short-term outcome, like writing an essay, passing a test, getting a good grade, but for a lifelong of learning, a life full of learning. Okay. So I don't know if we want to get into the details of progressive summarization. I have a super in-depth tutorial on my blog about how to do progressive summarization, but my basic answer is, when you take a note, the next time you come across that note, for any reason, and as you're reading it, as you're already expending the energy to just look over the note, anything that jumps out at you, that resonates, that surprises you, that moves you, you really want to use your intuitive side here, not your analytical side, because the analytical side of your brain takes up too much energy, right? You can't afford to make all these decisions analytically. You have to use your intuition. But as points resonate with you, just highlight them. It's like the campsite rule. I don't know if this exists everywhere, but the campsite rule, which is leave the campsite better than you found it. The same goes for your notes. Every time you touch a note, every time you interact with a note, just leave a highlight. And that way your future self will come across that highlight, see the results of your past effort, and know, okay, this was a point that my past self decided was noteworthy.
You have a nice framework in the book for deciding when to capture something. All right, to kind of alert you to that. Walk us through that. It starts with, what inspires you. You can't capture everything because that just overwhelms your system. You don't want to capture too little. So what are some good clues of something that you should set aside?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because the people who tend to pursue this kind of thing tends to be very smart, tends to be kind of nerdy, tends to be highly analytical, really like to, make decisions in a rational step-by-step way. I think consultants are like that too. And there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But here's the thing, is your note-taking system, your second brain, you really want to design it for your worst days, not your best days. Think about this for a sec. On your best days, when you have high energy, you're rested, you're balanced, you're grounded, you have all the motivation in the world, no distractions, you know what your goal is, you don't need a second brain on those days. In fact, any kind of system is just a hindrance. You are on fire. You're like an athlete who's made a string of baskets or a string of goals. You should just shed all structure and just go for it. When you need a note-taking system, or any system, is on the other days. Those other days, often like a Thursday or Friday afternoon at, it's 11:30, usually more like 1 or 2 or 3, when you are tired, you're a little burned out, you are overwhelmed, you've had a long week, you're hungry, you didn't sleep well. I don't know about you, but as I get older, I tend to have, and as I become a father and have kids, I tend to have more of those latter kind of days and fewer of the former kind of days. Those are the days that you need a system. Those are the days you need a structure. You need a guide rail, so that you don't have to use your precious mental capacity to figure out what to do next. Just such a hard decision. You just have a clear pathway. And so what I conclude from that is what I was saying before. You cannot create a note-taking system that forces you to make constant, highly taxing analytical decisions. You just can't do it. It's a recipe for disaster. Just trust me. You need to save that precious bandwidth for actually making, other decisions, higher order decisions to serve your clients. And the easiest way to do that, the most powerful way I've found, is to get in touch with your intuition, right? Your intuition, that side of you. A shortcut to do this is to get in touch with what I call resonance, which is another way of saying intuition. You have to get in touch with things that resonate with you. Okay, when you come across an idea, there is some sign, actually bodily, that is telling you this idea is interesting, unique, surprising, or helpful. What is that? Is it like a taste on the back of your tongue? For me, it's like I notice it's kind of like the room gets a little bit brighter. I think my pupils might be like dilating a little bit. You might get goosebumps on your arm or the back of your neck. You might feel this feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, whoa. You might feel all sorts of things. When you get in touch with those feelings, you can just rely on those feelings to tell you what to capture, how to organize something, where to categorize it, how to distill it, right? Because that feeling is your bodily intelligence. It's something within your body responding to that information in a way that uses much less energy than trying to make this kind of abstract intellectual decision. So there's not exactly a hack for this. If I could just flip a switch and have you get in touch with your intuition, I would. But it's a practice. It is a habit. It's something that you explore for yourself. But once you do, I think it's worth it, because I can hardly think of anything better for your life in general, for your career, for your business, than getting in touch with your intuition. That's the source of your decision-making, the source of your spontaneity, the source of your creativity, the source of your wisdom. And we have a way to practice accessing our intuition in our notes on a sentence by sentence level, right? It's like your notes can be this little like dojo where you practice one idea at a time, what it means to detect what resonates with you. And then once you train that skill, you take it out into the real world.
Now, you talk in the book about the generative effect, which I understand refers to the idea that once you actually have a place to start publishing or putting content, creating content, you actually get more ideas, and perhaps even just capturing, if you're kind of out there intentionally capturing things, you start noticing more. Talk to us a bit about that, what you've seen some of your students experience when they start capturing and then expressing on a consistent basis of just having more ideas and better ideas.
Yeah, this was really my own journey too. I years ago, I had such a scarcity driven view of creativity. I don't know where I got this from, especially since my family has a lot of artists and musicians, but even then, right, even surrounded by examples of creativity, I had this idea that creativity was like a finite resource, right? Like I have this reserve of creativity. Every bit that I use, now I have less, which is just absolutely not how creativity works. Creativity is the opposite. The more you use it, the more you express it and put it out there, the more you have. And it's very mysterious. It's almost metaphysical. I don't know how this works, but it's like karma or something. The more you give, the more you share, somehow the source of it within you picks up speed and starts to generate more. I think it has to do with like when you see the results, like when you see that concrete thing you've created, whether it's a painting or a song or a presentation or a speech or an event or whatever it is, suddenly your brain goes, oh, this is cool. This is rewarding. This is effective. This works. Let us now dedicate more resources to creating more. And then you put out more and see more reward, more results, and then you dedicate more resources. It's kind of like you create this feedback loop. And so I spend a lot of my time, again, the people who are, attracted to something like a second brain, a note-taking system, tend to be kind of OCD. right? We are kind of neurotic. We like order, we like to structure things, we like step-by-step processes. And the world doesn't recognize that those kinds of people can be creative as well, right? Like I hate how so much of society is like putting people in like the creative box, or you're a creative type, you're an artist, you're a writer, or you're an analytical type, you're an analyst, you're an engineer, you're something like that. Like as if human beings are sortable into two categories. I think the truth is that you need both sides, right? You need an efficient, structured process, and you need spontaneity and chaos and randomness. And so what I'm trying to do is bring both of those aspects of creativity to people. Like, how much easier would it be to spontaneously express yourself if you could just look at this centralized repository, this treasure trove library of all the most amazing raw material you've encountered over months and years? Wouldn't that be way more feasible than just trying to like make something up? And so I forgot your original question.
Actually, let me ask you, this is a little off the cuff, but are you in a situation right now to help really illustrate it to all of us? Could you, show us your Evernote setup and share your screen there so people can see a real life, how you're doing it, and maybe show us some notes and how you organize it.
Sure. Yeah, this is my real second brain. This is Evernote. I've been using it for a decade. There's a lot of other options you can use, but I like Evernote. Over here on the left, I'll give you kind of a quick tour. We have my notebooks, those different groupings and categories that I was referring to, including all my currently active projects right here, my areas of responsibility, all the different aspects of my personal life, my business, which is all the ones beginning with FL for Forte Labs, and then resources, which is everything else I'm interested in, curious about, or learning about. From books and writing to Christmas presents, to climate change, to generosity, to languages, to neuroscience, to stock photos, to videos. And then finally, the archives, which is anything from the previous three categories, projects, areas, and resources, that is completed, finished, on hold, postponed. And those four letters, by the way, P for projects, A for areas, R for resources, A for archives, those form what I call PARA, my PARA system, which is by far the most popular framework I've ever created. You can find a very in-depth guide to it on my blog. Just search for Tiago Forte. So that is kind of the structure of my second brain. Within any given notebook, like let's take the launch of my book. This is a reverse chronological list from the most recent at the top to the oldest at the bottom of every single note involved in the launch of my book. Right? And this is one of the largest projects I've ever undertaken. And it's only 77 notes, right? It's a significant number, but imagine if what was standing between you and the biggest dream or goal in your life was just 77 notes. It's quite concrete. It's quite feasible, isn't it? You can collect 77 ideas, 77 stories, 77 anecdotes, examples, models, case studies. And what that includes is such a wide variety of things. So everything from book notes or links or PDFs on other books, how they were launched, to articles that other people have written about how they launched their books, right? Like here's one, you can see it's bold with the different giveaways that he had, to the websites of other authors that I admire, to a brainstorm of different subtitles that I was considering using for the book, to marketing plans, to calls with, promotional agencies, to random screenshots just as a keepsake, to quotes, which I was going to use, like at the beginning of chapters as little epigraphs, to research, here's an article on brains, to affiliate programs, to discount, examples of how to frame discounts, to the results of Twitter polls. This is a screenshot of a Twitter poll that I ran. You can see it's extremely eclectic. There's so many different kinds of inputs that we need to do a kind of a novel creative project like launching a book. And so that's some of the stuff that I keep in my second brain.
That's amazing. While we have that up, I want to just open it up and see if attendees, what questions do you have for Tiago while he has his second brain up of how he captures, organizes, distills, expresses.
Yeah, I have a question here. This is Raul. Tiago, do you sometimes feel that you may tend to do some analysis, paralysis, or structure? Because this happens to me sometimes. So I'm a creative person. Sometimes I think I structure too much. I lose more time in structuring than in actually using the information. So how do you know that? And if it happens, how do you solve it?
My constant tendency towards analysis paralysis is the entire reason that I need a second brain. My first brain is absolutely neurotic, full of anxiety, always afraid of uncertainty, resistant to change, right? It's like my first brain is full of false assumptions, limiting beliefs, traumas from the past, right? And so it's funny, my approach to all that, like there's, personal growth and self-improvement, which is wonderful. But another approach is to simply kind of go around all of that stuff, right? Like instead of trying to change how my first brain works, I kind of like my first brain. I don't want to change who I am. I don't want to change how my brain works. The human brain is the most amazing, unique thing in the entire universe. Why would I want to change this? Instead of changing this primarily, I'm just going to outsource a lot of that to an external system, which is not subject to my limiting beliefs and blind spots. So I absolutely have a tendency toward analysis paralysis. One of the ways that I get around that is by simply making a notebook, a folder for each of my current projects, just compiling all the stuff that I know, or I think, or I wonder, or I learn into those notebooks. And then I can just decide today, I'm going to focus on this project, double click on that project, limit myself to only the notes within that container for one day or half a day or 1 hour or however much time I have, right? It's really difficult to sort of compartmentalize like that with your first brain, right? Your first brain is this messy cloud of ideas. You can't really create clear separation and distinctions and focus on one thing. My second brain makes that much easier.
Fantastic. Let's go to Mark next. Mark has a question.
So you have a lot of material organized, but then there's the final published or the significant distillation of that material. How do you segregate that in your second brain to say, out of the thousands of notes, here's the 10 that are ready for the next step, whatever that means?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So first, I would say I really think of my second brain as a publishing system. There's different metaphors you could use. It is a storage system, yes. It's an archival system, yes. It's a memory system, yes. But I found it most helpful to think of myself as like a publishing house, like the ultimate destination of as many ideas as possible. I want to become some external thing, which is usually writing, but can also be a video on our YouTube channel, can be a tweet, can be a Facebook post. I mean, being present online at all, even if you're not like a professional content creator, you're constantly creating content, right? Every Instagram post is content. Every Facebook post is content. Every blog post, every tweet, every Slack message you send, every email. I love when people tell me I've never created content. Really? How many hours per day do you spend writing emails? You don't think that's content? You don't think those emails could be more succinct, more actionable, more direct, better designed, better structured? Like seriously. But I think this depends on you. Like what in your work or in your business is the most common kind of outcome? Like start at the end and then just work your way backward and say, taking steps upstream, what are the basic building blocks that are going to make it easiest to produce that kind of outcome? What would you say? I'm curious that would be for you.
Oh, okay. So in other words, a article that consolidates a lot of research into something concise and unique would be the end point. And so then what I'm hearing you saying is to then point backwards to what kind of information is needed to be able to collect this, do a little research to make sure it's not repeating what has already been done, and then have that at my end point, but have the others in a different area that endpoint points backwards to, and then those can be, and that's what I was curious, what kind of structure do you use to say this is related to this endpoint document, but I don't want it to clutter my focused tweaking of this endpoint article?
Absolutely. That's the entire point. So think of that article as a project. Writing an article is, you got to think small here. Don't put on your to-do list, write article. Writing an article, especially one like you described, is a freaking project. There's so many tasks you're going to have to take, so many ideas you're going to have to incorporate. So create a notebook or a tag or a folder or whatever it looks like in your note-taking app. The very, like, one thing I know for sure, the very basic need that you have is to have all the material related to that article in one place. Isn't that the most fundamental need you have to actually make progress on that?
Tiago, one of your sayings that I found helpful is don't start a project until you're like 80 or 90% done.
So this is kind of an advanced level, right? Because, okay, you can decide I'm going to write an article on X and then go and start capturing, organizing, distilling, and then finally get to expressing. That's great. But eventually you'll reach a critical mass of notes. Like as note-taking becomes a part of your practice. And by the way, my average number of notes that I take is 2 per day for like the past decade, only 2 notes per day. Were there 2 things today that you learned? Were there 2 quotes that you found interesting? 2 comments in meetings that might be worth revisiting? 2 emails you received? There's probably 100. Just pick 2. So in the beginning, you're sort of collecting just small groups of notes to do one thing, to write that one article, give that one presentation. But the nature of knowledge is that it's not linear. It's not like one idea can only be used in one way. Ideas can be used many ways, and they get better the more different kinds of ways you use them. So eventually, after doing, two notes a day, after 6 months, you saved, 400 notes. At that point, you already have a critical mass, and you can reach this point where you just go in there. Instead of asking, what do I want to do? What are the notes that I need to take to do that? You ask, what knowledge have I already collected that I can just reshape into something that you didn't necessarily plan on creating, but you've already done, like Will said, 80% of the work, which is gathering the stuff. Your prioritization becomes backward, where you start taking on projects and clients just because you've already done most of the work instead of vice versa. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Natalie has her hand raised.
Okay, so my question is, I get kind of what you're saying, but what if you, don't necessarily have a project in particular, or you have a whole bunch of projects, and when you're reading the information or you're seeing something, it's interesting, but it might not be for like a particular project you're working on. But you want to capture that because in the future it could be important. Or you're reading something and it could apply to like 5 things that you're working on, or it could be something that's important for you, for your medical stuff, or something like all these. It could have many applications. So it's one thing, but it can go in like 10 different places. So it also, addition to that question is, I know that when I take notes, I can get caught up in the like, okay, what do I label this? What folder does this go into, and whatever else? And by the time I've decided all of that, I've forgotten why I wanted to take the note in the first place. I want to be able to just take the note, but then I want to be able to find the note. And like, what's the best way to like do that if you're not necessarily attaching it to a project?
It speaks to there's a paradox about research, which Sankey Arens in his book, How to Take Smart Notes, talks about this. We're taught, how does research work? You think of a topic, and then you think of a hypothesis, and then you do all the research, and then you do an experiment or some sort of test, right? That's actually not how it works at all, right? Even in science, even in the most formal scientific settings, how it actually works is someone gets obsessed with something for no reason that makes much sense. I'm obsessed with it. They research it, they read about it, learn about it, immerse themselves in it. They become familiar with it. You have to become familiar with something before you even know what an interesting hypothesis is. How can you even know what a good question is until you've had some exposure? So the research actually comes first. Then later on, you decide an experiment or a hypothesis, right? So it's kind of what you were saying. The paradox is you have to keep things before, you have to save things before you know how you're going to use them.
But I got to get to those things now. So, I mean, how would I be labeling them so that I can know, oh my gosh, that would be great for this other thing, or these 2 things, they actually are the same thing. Yeah. Like I want to find that connection, that thing.
Yeah, a couple things. So this is primarily why we have the resources folders. Until something is part of a project, you want it kind of tucked away.
Okay.
Right. You can't sit down at your computer and be faced with hundreds or thousands of different possibilities. That's a recipe for overwhelm. So you want to make a distinction. There's a small amount of information, maybe 1%, 5% of all the notes you've taken that are directly actionable for your projects. And then everything else down here in resources. But that doesn't mean you can't move notes, and you can and you should from resources into projects. In fact, anytime you get stuck on a project, you're like, oh, I need an answer to a question. I need a data point. I need an example. I need a fact or statistic. Don't go to Google, right? The second you go to Google and you ask a question, 500 million results that you now have to sort through, right? Just
Mhm.
go right over to your resources and see what resource that I previously saved, whose application was not immediately clear, has now become clear because the projects have evolved. And I'm just constantly amazed how I often find maybe not exactly what I was looking for, but something that I can use by just switching my focus over here to the resources.
So it's like you bench them. They're on the bench. Like if you're like
Yes.
thinking about a team, it's like, okay, you're on the bench, you're getting ready, and then now, oh, I'm working on this project and I need something. And now I'm gonna go to the dugout and pick like somebody. Oh, you're perfect. Now I can bring you in. But
Exactly.
it's kind of like they're in waiting. It's just the group that's like in waiting, so to speak. So things are divided out in projects, but the things that don't fit into projects, they go, to this other place. And when
Exactly.
they're in the other place, are they categorized also kind of like I'm looking at multiple sclerosis? So I have stuff that's from multiple sclerosis, but if I find something that's, that's great for like I don't know, working with like, special needs kids, I could put that in there and I would do like I would tag it as that, but it would just be in there someplace else, not with the project.
Absolutely. Perfect example. Perfect
Okay.
example. You want as much in reserve as possible, right? Imagine if you're the manager of that baseball team. Imagine if the bench
Mhm.
was infinite in size and there was no cost. Like you could have as many players as you wanted. You didn't have to pay them or feed them. Like they're just
Mhm.
they're like, that's the great thing about information. It just stays right where it is in exactly the format it is basically forever, as long as we have the disk space, right?
Yeah.
The key thing is to make the distinction between what is at the, I think of it as the core and the periphery. What needs to be at the core of my attention, the center of my
Mhm.
attention needs to be very small, right? But as long as you have your attention there, all the stuff on the periphery can be extremely voluminous and
Okay.
extensive.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have one more question, Matthias, and then I have one question to close us out. So Matthias, go ahead and ask your
Thank you
question.
so much for a great session. I was just wondering, maybe could you show us an example of how each time you revisit a note, you highlight something, you make it stronger, just what that looks like, or what a really advanced note looks like?
Sure. I'll use an example from the same notebook. So it's interesting. Notice the dates here, right? It's mostly from early 2019 until today. But there's one little exception. There's a note from July of 2015. Okay. And this is often what happens is, since my usual preferred sorting is reverse chronological, it's kind of like a pile, by the way. Do you notice this? Like the new stuff on the top, the old stuff on the bottom. Like the psychology of piles is very much present here. But often at the very bottom of the pile, it's kind of like way down at the bottom of the filing box, it's like the origin. It's like the seed, the first seed that was planted, a single note that was like the start of everything. And for me, it was my notes. So different quotes and excerpts that I saved from Tim Ferriss, who was an author who influenced me a lot, wrote this extremely extensive post called The Comprehensive Guide to Writing a Book. Okay. And this is a good example. When people write comprehensive guides, you can't, every time you want to reference it, you can't go back to the original source, right? It took me hours to read this thing in the first place. I don't want to spend any more time going back and rereading what I already read. In fact, instead, when I read it the first time, I just save the parts that I think are important. Okay. And what you can see here is anything I thought was important is in bold, and anything I thought was really important is in yellow. That's basically progressive summarization, right? So think about, these are all like little details. Like once you submit the manuscript, you'll have 2 revision rounds. Okay, that's kind of interesting. When negotiating, say with a publisher, he who cares less wins. These are kind of interesting tidbits, right? But this was like a game-changing point. right? This is the signal in the noise. And I tend to want to add these different kinds of formatting at different times. So the first time that I kind of reviewed these notes, I just added bolts. And then only on this maybe third pass did once I had some distance, right? I stepped away, kind of forgot about this a little bit, and then came back to it with fresh eyes when I had more objectivity. This idea really stood out to me, which is when you're thinking about the book you want to write, which is going to consume half a decade of your life, like really. My book comes out in 40 days. It'll be a 3.5-year project. And only then do I have to start promoting and selling it, right? So this was a guiding question is, can this be the defining book in its category that will be just as valuable 5 years from now? That was such an important philosophical mindset question for me to ask myself. It's more important, more valuable than some of these other points. Some other ones are things like, only sign with a publisher who believes in your project as much as you do. That was really powerful. Right, so you can kind of tell I've made several passes at this. The first pass was reading the original article and adding text excerpts to this note in the first place. The second pass was bolding certain points. The third pass was adding highlights. That's an example of how a note gets developed over time. And honestly, this single note was probably the most influential on the entire project because it came so early. Like, think about that. Often the earliest learnings, the earliest realizations that you have are the most important because they shape everything else that comes after, which is another reason to start projects with existing notes rather than trying to start them from scratch. Does that help?
That's excellent. Thank you so much.
So Tiago, closing question. Let's say people are fired up, sold on this idea, and they don't currently have a note-taking app today. They haven't really been doing this. What would you say someone should do this afternoon to get started? What are the 2 or 3 steps to get started saying, I want to start my building second brain today?
So first thing I would do is choose your note-taking app using the Second Brain resource guide that I shared earlier. And most of all, the video. Like, just watch the video. In 10 minutes, I'll lead you through the steps to choose a note-taking app. Second, we just also published the 12 steps to get started building a second brain. Oh no, it's not quite published yet. I think it comes out on Tuesday. So basically sign up for my newsletter and then check your email inbox Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern, and you will see our most recent blog post, which is actually the last page of the book. It's word for word, the exact steps, the implementation steps that I outlined on the last page of the book that we've now published as a free blog post, which really lead you through what I found to be the 12 most important ways to get started. You don't have to take all of them. This isn't an all or nothing. This is absolutely not an all or nothing thing. And in fact, you're already doing it. This is the important thing. You're already taking notes. You're already managing large volumes of information. You're already using information to complete tasks and projects. All I'm asking you to do is be a little more strategic, a little more systematic, and a little more intentional, right?
And
so if there's even one of those 12 steps or 2 that resonate with you, just take those, and that's a great start.
And where do people go to sign up for your newsletter?
Yeah, so just go to, let me give you the exact link. Here you go. You can just enter your email right on that form.
Okay. And for those of you listening, that's fortelabs.co/subscribe, and send us a note. Those of you listening, we're going to send out 25 copies to the first 25 people that reach out to us. And Tiago, this was fantastic overview. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the launch of this book. I know thousands of students have taken your course and prospered thanks to it. And now you'll reach millions, I'm sure. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate the support, Will. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to be here.
All right. Thanks, everyone.